Well, welcome back. Back in the Word. We are in Romans today, chapter 7, verses 1 through 25. In my reading and reflection on this chapter, I've titled it The Futility of the Law. What we have here is Paul is going to address another question that might be coming up in the minds of his hearers. The question is, what about the Mosaic Law? What about the law that God gave? What is it sin? Does it lead to death? Is it bad? Paul's going to answer these questions, and he'll give us guidance. Again, this is in the context of this section that's on sanctification. So another way to look at this is, what is the relationship between the law and our salvation and our sanctification? What's the relationship there? And I'm talking about the law. I know some people sometimes divide it between the moral, the civil, and the ceremonial law. I think that's somewhat of a fictional division that's made, not made in the Bible. That kind of division of the law is not made in the Bible. It's, in fact, if you go back through the Levitical law and Deuteronomy, is so often those civil, moral, and ceremonial laws are all mixed together. They're not given in those categories. It's the law. It's the law of Moses. So what is the status of the law now that Christ has come? So chapter 7 then, this futility of the law, there's three sections here. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, talks about being free from the law. 7 through 13 address the purpose of the law. And then 15 through 25 addresses the work of the law. So it's the freedom from the law, purpose of the law, and work of the law that this chapter addresses. With regard to freedom from the law, Paul opens by addressing brothers here. I think he's addressing primarily Jewish believers, but in the early church, the churches were formed after, most often from members of synagogues who heard the message of the gospel. You can see this in Acts chapter 13 through 20, for example, on Paul's missionary journeys. He and his companions would go into a synagogue. They would preach Christ in the synagogue. Two groups of people would show interest, some Jews, and then what are called God-fearers. God-fearers would be men who were Gentiles, but were drawn to the Mosaic law, drawn to Judaism, and you can imagine why, they didn't want to undergo circumcision. So they were not fully converted to Judaism. They were what are called God-fearers. So they'd be very familiar with the Mosaic law, even though perhaps they had never submitted to the rite of circumcision and become formally Jews. So Paul addresses them. He addresses the Jewish brothers, and the God-fearers are hearing this. And he opens up in verses 1 through 3, basically making the point that a law ends with death. And he illustrates that in a couple of different ways, and then draws the conclusion in verses 4 through 6 that just as death ends the law, so in our union with Christ, remember we talked about that yesterday, that we're united with Christ, baptized into his death and raised to a new life. Just as we died in union with Christ, so in that union death, we've died to the law. We've been released to the law. So, again, what law is he talking about here? I think he's talking about immediately in view is the Mosaic law. You remember back in chapter 2, verse 14, he talked about Gentiles who obeyed their conscience. They were kind of a law to themselves. You may have that in mind as well, but I think primarily he's talking about the Mosaic law, and those who were Gentiles in the church would understand this. They would have a background to understand it. So this raises the question then, in chapter 7, verses 7 through 13, he asks this question then, is the law sin? I mean, he says it, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? And again, he says no in a very strong way. In that verse, he says no, by no means. So what is the purpose of the law? And that's what this section is about. What is the purpose of the law? At the end of verse 7, he says the law reveals sinfulness of sin. That's the point of the law. People sometimes abuse the law, even today, thinking that keeping some or all of the Mosaic law is going to help us to be more righteous, more holy, more sanctified. But that's not the purpose of the law at all. The purpose of the law, according to Paul here, is to reveal sin and define sin, define what it is. One of the definitions of sin that Paul alludes to here, not alludes, but he talks to it specifically, is covetousness. Interesting choice here that Paul has made. Later on in the book of Philippians, we'll see that Paul claimed to be, as far as the law was concerned, righteous, sinless, basically. Which means not so much that he never broke a law, but that if he broke a law, he followed through with the sacrifices that were required. But this is covetousness is an inward sin. It's not a sin that we would necessarily see in someone else, because it's something that we do in our mind, where we desire what someone else has, whether it's material or their wife, their status in life, is covetousness. And that's what Paul talks about, how law revealed covetousness in him. And then he gives his personal example from the end of verse 7 through verse 11, how that law worked in him to produce sin, to produce an awareness of sin. Reveals that the law is good, but at the same time revealed that Paul was not. And that's the purpose of the law. That's the purpose of God's law, is to reveal our utter sinfulness. It's sin that produces death, not the law. It's sin that condemns us, not the law. The law didn't produce death. The purpose of the law then, according to Paul in these verses, was simply this: to define and reveal sin in us. And then starting in verse 14, Paul talks about the work of the law. Before I get into these verses, let me point out, and you'll be wondering yourself as you go through this, is Paul talking about the experience of a Christian or the experience of a non-Christian? Is he talking about the struggle that someone has once they're saved, their struggle to be holy? Or is he talking about a non-believer's struggle with sin, someone trying to pursue righteousness through the law? Is Paul talking about himself before he became a Christian? Or is he talking about himself after he became a Christian? Well, the answer to these questions are way beyond the time we have in a 15-minute video, just to encourage you to read it for yourself. So I'd encourage you to ask those questions and come to a conclusion yourself. My view, and I'll just give it here without explaining it too much, is that what Paul is talking about is how the law works to bring someone from conviction to conversion. That is, how the law is at work in someone's life. Whether it was Paul or you or I, this is a person who is ultimately saved, is what's happening here. It's that journey that the law takes them on from conviction to conversion, is my view here. So if you don't agree with me, we can still be friends. We can have sit down with a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or whatever your drink of choice is, and discuss it sometime, perhaps if we're face to face. But that would be my view as we follow through this. So in verse 14, he introduces this section with pointing out the conflict between the law that's spiritual, the spiritual aspect of the law, and my flesh, or our flesh, which is bound to sin. This is a conflict that's primarily internal. It's in our soul, it's in our spirit. We've all been there, I think, before our conversion. Sometimes we experience that now where we are struggling with recurring sin in our life, whether it's lust or pornography or greed or anger, that we struggle internally, struggle in our spirit. And Paul points out that this is a conflict between the spiritual law and the flesh, which is bound to sin, and it's a conflict that's worked out in us, that's active. Verses 15 through 17, it ultimately points us to the fact that we're controlled by sin. So first we see the conflict, and then we see the controlling power in our lives at one point, which is sin. That's what law is revealing here, that sin controls us. And then in verses 18 through 20, it talks about the confusion that's the fruit of this both conflict and this control of sin in our lives. Paul says in verses 18 through 20, he says, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me." That's the effect of the law. "That is in my flesh, for I have the desire to do what is right." So he's saying here that maybe about himself, or just talking about the journey of a Christian, the person that becomes a Christian, at some point they know in their soul that they want to do good, but they can't. And he says, "I desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." Haven't we been there? I mean, it's a common experience, and I think continues somewhat into the Christian life, that we struggle with sin. The struggle goes on. But I think, again, if we look at the context here, the context is talking about the purpose of the law, and this is the work of the law. So it leads us from this sense of conflict going on within ourselves to a recognition that sin controls us. It leads to confusion, and ultimately it leads to our conversion in verses 21 through 25. And I'll just come to the end here. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord, so that I myself serve the law of God in my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. So Paul's liberated here, not totally sanctified is what he's talking about here. He's still sinning, but he's released from the penalty of sin, released from the shame, released from the guilt, and he's free to drive on. And we'll talk about that in chapter 8, this power to live out progressively, continuously, this life of salvation. So again, in my view here, what's happened in verses 14 through 25 is Paul's taken us through the work of the law, from first revealing this conflict in us, raising in us a desire to do well without the power, a recognition that the power is not there to do it, leads to confusion and conflict, and ultimately our conversion. So I think Paul is describing the work of the law there, would be my view of these. So what is the application here? Well, number one, the law is very informative. I don't want you to walk away from this video saying that we can throw out the Old Testament. Far from it. The law is extremely informative. It is just not transformative. That's the point Paul's making here in the context of a discussion about sanctification. The law points out sin. The law does not save. The law does not sanctify. The law points forward to the Savior and Sanctifier, Jesus Christ. The pursuit of fixing ourselves, no matter how you're trying to do that, whether it's adhering to the Mosaic law or some other law, that ultimately leads to frustration. And brothers and sisters, if you are on that path, if you are trying to fix yourself and you are feeling that frustration, that confusion, that conflict well up in you, I say thank God for that, because that is evidence that He is working in you. And you need to take that next step and put those things aside and be converted. Depend on Christ. I was in this position myself 30 or 40 years ago. I was trying to fix myself. I was a disciple of what's called today New Thought, or these self-help programs by Napoleon Hill and guys like Earl Nightingale, and I thought I could follow them and follow their rules and follow their guidance and fix myself, and it just led to sorrow and tears and frustration until Christ came and saved me and began that work of sanctification in me. I pray that you do the same thing. I pray that you abandon any kind of law or law keeping and give yourself fully and totally to Christ. Be converted if you're not. If you are, embrace the sanctification that He has for you. God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow when we get into Romans chapter 8, which talks about the power to live this kind of life set apart for God. God bless you.